Hi guys. Today I'm going to be showing you guys how to do one or two things in Laravel, and we're going to be talking about um interface. Right now, imagine if you were given a project where you should build a news aggregator API, for instance, and then what your API does is that it fetches news from different news sources. So in this case, I'm going to be using NewsAPI, NY Times, and Guardian News. So now what you are meant to do is you write an API that what the API does is that it fetches news from those multiple sources and return it in one model, return it to the user. For instance, now you want to create a website or a news platform where people can come and read news from multiple sources, right? So what your code should do is that it just um, as those news sources are posting news every minute or something, your own code should fetch news from these different sources and then add them to your own, store them in your own database so that it can be returned for the user with the news sources. So most developers will do this thing in a straightforward manner. Now I already have an article controller here that queries my database because I already have a model, an article model, right? I have a database already, an article model already that fetches, that has different columns: title, content, source, and the rest of them. Let me just open the migration so you guys can see it properly. So I have this schema for my article. I have this controller that fetches my article from the database table, right, and just returns it. Now I already have I've applied filters where you can search for articles, right, and filter them by the date, category, or sources, or even limit the number of articles to show in a page. So we're going to run this and see how it looks in the front. So when I check my API route, this is what I see. I get different articles. Like this is an article, the first data has a title and content, and then this particular data is from the Guardian News, right? From the Guardian News, it was published few hours ago, and this is the direct URL to go and read more, to go and check the article on the Guardian News, right? Second article, also from the Guardian News, and we have more. Now we can filter the article by the source, right? We have filter here to filter by the source. No, we can do something like where source, like source, something like this. So I don't want the source to be strict because it seems like it's strictly searching for because when I use the strict search for the source, all I just get is exactly the same data type. Like I must use the same exact data structure for it. So I just want it to be that if the source has Guardian in it at all, you should just fetch that for us. So let's see if that will work. Yeah, it works now. Works now, yeah. So basically what I just did was that I, instead of searching for source directly, I filter by the source where you just have whatever you input as the source. So currently if I search for NY Times in the source, I should get, it means there are no articles that have NY Times. Let's see, News API. So it seems only Guardian was first for us. Okay, they're actually there. Okay, so the source are different sources. This is BBC News, NBC News. Oh, okay. So if I search for BBC, I should get article from BBC. All right, that works. Okay, so this basically just queries your database and then filters it by different filter parameters, either by source types. You can filter by the dates, from date and to date. You can search for any particular article you want to search for. So, but then how do you get these articles? It's not just by um showing the articles in your database. How do you get these articles from these multiple sources? Now, most developers are going to just use the straightforward method where they just maybe you have, let's say you have a function that fetches article, right? And then, sorry, this my link that just helps me a lot. Copilot, I mean. So what they just do here now is they just to fetch an article, they just like maybe call different news API. For instance, since I said we are using the Guardian News, we are using NY Times, and we are using News API. Now you can get API keys from this platform. You can get NY Times, for instance. You can get API key from NY Times. If you search NY Times API, yeah, you can get API key from NY Times. Same for Guardian News and News API. I already have API key stored. So now what most people are going to do is that they'll just maybe write multiple controllers or multiple services that fetches from these APIs, right, directly and stores in their database. But in this case, I'm trying to I like writing code in a way that if you write the code, it can be reusable and easier to understand and straightforward and faster to write, right? So that you won't have to repeat yourself multiple times. Because um, imagine writing different services like I already have here. I have multiple services, right? For Guardian News, for instance. Now, this is a service that fetches article from Guardian News. So this is the Guardian News base URL, and it fetches article from Guardian News and formats the article in this method, right? And then we also have a News API service that fetches article from News API and formats the article in the same method. And we have NYTime API service also that does the same exact thing. Now, what most people are going to do in this case, junior developers and intermediate developers, what they do in this case is that they might just maybe write a controller that calls these different services and say something like, let's say I want to fetch article from database. Um, I can say, for instance, Guardian service equals, then I make an instance of the Guardian service, of the Guardian news service, right? Now I get an instance of the Guardian news service, right? Now I can now call the article and say article equals Guardian service, and I fetch article from Guardian service. Sorry. And I fetch article from Guardian service, right? Because in this Guardian service, we already have a method that fetches article. So fetch articles, that should not throw error. Yeah. So what most people will do here is that maybe they will have something like this that fetches article from Guardian service, and they will have this same controller, something like this for News API and NY Times at the same time. So in this case, I feel like you are repeating the same thing multiple times. You are writing the same kind of code. So we want to fetch API from multiple. Imagine having 100 news sources, and then you're writing the same thing for 100 different API services, right? But let's not waste time. I'll just go straight to the best way to do this. Now, how I implemented mine is a very straightforward way, and it can seem technical, but it's actually very easy. It's what we call interface in Laravel. So interface is a way of creating it's just like the name sounds, interface. You are creating an interface for different sources, right? You want to have different services, but these services follow the same pattern. I create an interface for them to follow, right? So what I did here now is, now I have these three new services and I have a news aggregator here. Now what this news aggregator does is that it's for each of those news services, right, it fetches article for them and merge them, which is what most people would have done in their controller, right? But in this case, I don't do that. You don't just write this aggregator service and then it doesn't end there. You're still going to have, you will still repeat code if you just use this. So what you do is that you create an interface. I have an interface here, right? Now this is a new source interface. Now what this interface does is that it's just like you creating a skeleton for a project. I am creating a skeleton for all of you to follow. Like I'm creating a pattern for every new services to follow. That's what an interface does. Now if I have 100 different new services and those services implement an interface, they must follow the same pathway that I've paved for them using that interface. That's what it means. So I have an interface here, a new source interface that that has a function, fetch articles. Now, any service that is implementing this new source interface must have this particular function called fetch articles. If I define another function here, it means that any service that implements this new source interface must also have that function. Now, if you check our services, each of those services have fetch articles, right? Each of them have fetch articles and each of them implements the news source interface, right? So if you look at it here, you see that they all implement news source interface, and as that, based on that, they now have to make use of the fetch articles as the pattern that the news source interface already laid out for them. So now that's not all, that's not enough. Now after creating this new source interface and then implementing them in your different services, now what we need to do now is to let our um our code know that, okay, this particular service is the one you should use to handle this particular stuff. Now on doing that, what we need to do is, if you come to this news aggregator here, right, I have a function in news aggregator that adds sources. Now you might not need this at all. You might need to let's take for instance, you are building your own news platform in a way that you are not aggregating all the news together. You're just maybe using one particular source. Let's say I want to write my code in a way that I will have 100 multiple news sources, but I don't want to use 100 of them at the same time. I want to maybe use them one after the other. I want to use Guardian News today, and then tomorrow I want to be able to switch from Guardian News to NY Times without having to rewrite my code, right? I just want to just switch, maybe just one toggle switch or something, from Guardian News to NY Times, from NY Times to News API, different news. If you like, have 1,000 news sources. Now if you want to be able to do something like that, then interface is the best way to use to do that. Now all you need to do is to define which particular source to use. Now if you look at this service, the news aggregator service, now if I want to use just Guardian News in my code, right, all I need to do is to just define the source as Guardian News. And then if you look at this, for each of the source defined, it fetches article and merge all the articles together. So if I have an array of sources, right, if I don't want to add source now, and I just have an array of sources like this, I can say, okay, I want to use just only 2 out of all my multiple services, right? And I define those 2 sources, right? And those 2 sources can be something like, let's say the first source is um app services news, and I have news API service, right, column class. And then you do the same thing for, now because I have just news API service, it's only going to use news API service. Then do the same thing for different multiple services, right? That's if I'm not using this add source thing, if I'm trying to use multiple sources, right? So because I'm in a class, I can't define this way. I have to, sorry, if at all I'm going to do that, I can do it in a different way, but we'll come back to that. So now this interface helps you to like define multiple news sources, right? Now I can choose to use only one source, and when I run my code, only that source is going to be fetching news for me. If I add 5 different news sources to this source, then 5 different news sources are going to be fetching the news for me. So that's what this does. And now what we have here, now we have a function that adds sources. Now I want to be able to add multiple sources to this my source array here, and then aggregate the news. That's for each of those sources. I call the same method that all of them has, which is the fetch article, and then it fetches all the article in the same format. Note that it's the same format. We are formatting all the article to look the same exact way. So it fetches all the article in the same format and then merge all of them. And then for each of those merged articles, now I can now insert them to my database the way I want to insert them to my database, right? So my database already has all these columns waiting: title, content, source, and the rest. So I format these my articles following the same pattern, and then when I fetch the articles and merge all of them, I can now update. I'm using update or create because I don't want to have multiple I don't want to have the same news inserted multiple times, right? So we have the URL of the news from our APIs, from our news sources that was fetched. So instead of you inserting directly, I use update or create, so that if there's, what this does is that it searches for the URL in the database, and if the URL already exists, it just updates it to the article. But if it doesn't exist, it inserts a new one. So that's what it does. So this way now, we can easily aggregate multiple news sources in one. So we are writing code for multiple news sources and inserting it into your database. Now, I don't want to have I don't want to write any controller that calls this news aggregator service and the rest. Now, what I just need to do is I want this to run in my background. For instance, I just want to just create a blog, a news blog. I want to, like, let's say you have a news platform, a blog that shows multiple news, and then I just want to just create this blog and go and relax, right? Maybe you have Google AdSense or something. I don't know about that, but let's say you have a blog, and then your blog just shows updated news, and then um you don't want to be posting news every time. I don't even want to even be looking at my blog. I just know that my blog is always updated with news from multiple sources, right? So that way I can make this code to run in the background using scheduler or whatever. The code runs in the background, and then it just updates my news for me. I can set it every minute, and every minute the news are updated, and then my viewers get updated news from multiple news sources, right? So in order to do that, what I did now is that I created a command to fetch news. Now what this command does is that, if you look at this command now, I already named my command news fetch, right? Now what it does is that it's first of all, I pass the aggregator service to the constructor, right? So when this command is being created, it's created with the aggregator service in the constructor. Now all it just does is that it just calls the aggregate news function here. That's this particular function is what's be called. So it just calls this aggregate news, and that's all. So now this command, I can now decide to now um set this in my cron to run. Normally, if you want to fetch news, I can as well do php artisan news fetch, since I already defined my console command here, right? News fetch, right? And once I do this, it fetches the news from different news sources, right? And then once that is done, you can see that. So now you can see that it has updated our news articles from multiple sources. Now, what we can do now is, instead of running this locally, we can now schedule this particular command to run maybe hourly or so on. Like, for instance, I have added it here. I've added the command here, right? That runs this hourly. So every hour this command is run, and the news are fetched and stored in my database. So basically what it does is that it calls my command, which is the fetch news command, right? And then what the fetch news command does is that it calls this aggregate news from the news aggregator service, right? And what the aggregate news does, first of all, it adds from our what we did now is that we have this function that adds sources, and these sources are being added from this our news service provider here, right? So the news service provider, we already registered the multiple sources, right? So since multiple sources are already registered in the provider, once the app runs, this provider is registered. We should register that provider here. If you use this later version of Laravel, this is where we register providers. I think the old version of Laravel, providers are registered in the kernel file or so. So we register a provider here. I already registered my new service provider under bootstrap slash provider.php, right? And then once the app runs, the provider is being called, and then these different news sources are added to the news aggregator service. So we add these three different sources: Guardian News, NY Times, and NewsAPI. If I want just Guardian News and NY Times, I can just easily comment out this one, and then I'll have only two sources. So if I have all these sources now, adding news to my adding to my aggregator service, right? Now, each of this new source now will now call this fetch article. So what we did in this aggregate news is that for each of those sources, which are those three sources that have been added once the app run, for each of those sources, we now call these fetch articles. These fetch articles, remember, the fetch articles is being implemented by all the services using this interface, right? We have three implementations. You can see we have three implementations of this news source interface. We have the Guardian News Service implementing the news source interface. We have the NY Times implementing the news source interface. And we have the News API also implementing the news source interface. Right? And each of them have the fetch articles method that fetches the article from each of them sources, and then formats the article in the way our database can easily accept it. So our aggregator service calls the fetch article from those different services using the interface. So interface is like an interceptor of the services, right? And then merges all the articles into one array. And now for each of those articles, we can now update or create in our database. The reason why we're using update or create so that we don't have repeated articles, right? So if the URL already exists, it will just update the article, else it will create a new one. So that's a simple and straight. You can see that the code is straightforward and there's no repetition of code and everything works fine. We have we have then we now have our controller that we just use to now display these articles that we've added to our database, which is what we did here, and can be filtered by dates, sources, categories, and the rest of them, right? So that's that. And then we have the API here for the different articles. So this simple way of implementing interface, kindly do well to follow and like this video and follow my YouTube channel. I'm going to make more videos explaining how interfaces work properly, right? I will give you a more detailed explanation, beginner friendly explanation of how interfaces work, and I will give examples also of how you can make use of interface in different scenarios. For instance, you have maybe like a payment platform that accepts payment from multiple sources. Let's say you want to accept payment using Stripe, Flutter, multiple different payment systems, and you want to do it in a way that you can, from a comfort zone, you can switch payment service anytime you want. So for instance, you're accepting payment with Stripe today, and then maybe Stripe is down or something, start having issue, you can just, with one click of a button, you can just switch from Stripe to Paystack without touching any part of your code, something like that. Interface will help you make that very easy. So what you need to do is just to call an interface service and then just add a particular provider. I'm going to make a video on how you can do this using interface. It's as simple as that, just like we did here. Now, what I can as well decide to just maybe I can decide to just maybe have an env add env file that defines my default news service, for instance, and then I say my default news service is Guardian, and then I have maybe a switch case here, or a, what's it called, um an if statement that if it's Guardian, then make use of this guide, you add the Guardian source. If it's ny times, you add the ny times, and so on. You can as well decide to have like maybe an array. I can have an array of sources somewhere, maybe in my config file. I can have an array of sources, and then I'll just, maybe for each of those sources in my config file, then you add the source like this, something like that, so that you can have multiple news sources. I can decide to just choose maybe 2 out of the 3 news sources. You can have 1,000 news sources, and maybe you just want to be switching them from time. And with this method, you can build a news platform where you don't have to be actively posting news, updating your blog and the rest. You just relax, and news is being fetched from multiple sources to your blog. As simple as that. So thank you for sitting through this video. Please kindly subscribe and leave a comment. I'm going to drop the link to this to the GitHub of this code in the description, so that you can go through the code on your own and try to understand it better from my GitHub. Thank you so much.